A British king just did what Canadian diplomats, trade negotiators, and an entire Prime Minister's office spent over a year failing to do. He stopped Donald Trump. Not with a treaty, not with a threat, not with a phone call between heads of state, with a conversation. A single private exchange that, according to a new book by one of Britain's most respected royal biographers, appears to have quietly ended Trump's year-long obsession with making Canada the 51st state of the United States. Stay with me because the details of how this happened will completely change the way you understand power in 2026. If you have been following this story, drop a 1 in the comments right now, because most people have no idea this happened, and you need to share this with every Canadian you know. For over a year, Donald Trump treated the border between the United States and Canada like it was drawn in pencil. He called Canada cherished. He suggested it would fare better inside the American Union. He repeated the 51st state line so many times it stopped sounding like a joke and started sounding like a policy briefing. Canadians felt it immediately. Consumer confidence dropped. The Canadian dollar weakened. Businesses quietly began shifting supply chains away from American dependency. Provincial governments drew up contingency plans that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. And ordinary Canadians, for the first time in living memory, began asking a question their grandparents never had to ask. What happens if America decides it no longer wants us to exist as a separate country? That question hung over everything, and standard diplomacy had no answer for it. Here is where the story gets genuinely astonishing, and I need you to stay with me because this next part is the part nobody is talking about. Prime Minister Mark Carney made a decision in 2025 that political analysts called either brilliant or reckless, depending on who you asked. He invited King Charles III to personally deliver the throne speech before the Canadian Parliament. This was not ceremony. This was strategy. Carney's team had figured out something that career diplomats had missed entirely. Trump did not respond to trade memos. He did not respond to firmly worded statements from Ottawa. But Trump responded to crowns, to pageantry, to monarchy, and especially to King Charles, a figure Trump has spoken about with genuine personal warmth for years. King Charles stood before the Canadian Parliament and delivered 5 words that cut straight across the border. He said, "The true north is strong and free." That phrase, pulled directly from the Canadian national anthem, was not a greeting. It was a declaration. It was Canada's constitutional head of state telling the world, and Washington specifically, that this country is not available for absorption. Every member of Parliament stood. The ovation lasted long enough that observers described it as unlike anything they had witnessed in years. And in the White House, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. If this story matters to you, pause right now and share this video. The people around you deserve to understand what actually happened here. Now, here is the moment that changes everything. And I want you to understand exactly why it matters before I tell you what Trump said. Robert Hardman, a British royal biographer who has spent decades documenting the Windsor family, was granted an interview with Trump earlier this year for his upcoming book. Hardman did not dance around the Canada issue. He told Trump directly that any American effort to annex Canada would deeply trouble King Charles, because the king is Canada's constitutional head of state. And Trump, the man who never retreats, the man who doubles down on everything, the man whose entire political identity is built on never yielding ground, paused. Then he asked a question that revealed something extraordinary about the gap between Trump's ambitions and his actual understanding of the country he had been threatening. He asked whether Canadians still recognize the king. Let that settle for a moment. The most powerful person on earth, who had spent more than a year publicly musing about absorbing an independent nation of 40 million people, apparently did not know that Canada's head of state is the same monarch he personally admires. He did not know that the face on Canadian currency wears a crown. He did not know that Canada stood beside the Allies at Normandy under that same crown. Hardman told him all of it, and Trump, for the first time on record, said something that sounded like a retreat. He acknowledged that Canada has 200 years of history. He acknowledged the emotional weight of "Oh, Canada." He acknowledged that you cannot simply erase a nation that has existed longer than the modern American Republic itself. From a president who treats concession like surrender, that acknowledgement is seismic. What Carney's team built and what Hardman's conversation completed was, in effect, an unofficial diplomatic shield, constructed not from international law or bilateral agreements, but from something Trump actually respects: personal loyalty to a monarch. The British Crown, an institution with no formal political power in international affairs, became the most effective diplomatic tool Canada had available. That is both a remarkable achievement and a deeply uncomfortable truth. But now I need to tell you something that the relief of this story tends to obscure, because the threat has not ended. It has evolved. And the new version is quieter, harder to fight, and in some ways more dangerous than anything Trump said publicly. A January Ipsos poll found that 56% of Canadians either strongly or somewhat agree that the United States would not fully rule out military action against Canada. 56%. A majority of Canadians now believe their closest ally and longest-standing neighbor might someday consider force. That level of distrust has no modern precedent in the history of these two countries. The trade pressure has not lifted. Tariffs remain active on Canadian aluminum, lumber, automotive parts, and a growing list of goods. The Canadian dollar remains under strain. Cross-border infrastructure investment has declined sharply, and Trump, even while appearing to have shelved the 51st state language, has reportedly continued telling advisors that the Canadian Arctic is undefended, strategically critical, and insufficiently protected by Ottawa. That is not annexation language, but it is pressure language, and it points in the same direction. More alarming still is the reporting that the Trump administration has been holding conversations with Alberta separatist leaders. Alberta's independence movement has long existed on the margins of Canadian politics, but direct contact from Washington transforms it into something else entirely. You do not need to annex a country to destabilize it. You only need to quietly encourage the fractures that already exist inside it. Mark Carney now faces a problem that has no clean diplomatic solution. He neutralized the loudest version of the threat. But the quieter version, economic pressure, Arctic anxiety, internal separatist outreach, that version does not yield to a throne speech or a biographer's interview. It requires something harder. Broadened trade relationships Canada has been promising itself for decades. Real Arctic defense investment. Substantive engagement with Western provinces before Washington does it instead. And a national story compelling enough that no future Canadian generation looks south and wonders whether joining might be easier than staying. The deeper lesson this story teaches us about power in 2026 is one that should make every observer of international affairs pause. The independence of 40 million people, with their own parliament, their own history, their own identity, their own flag, may have been preserved, at least temporarily, not by a treaty, not by a coalition, not by military deterrence, but by the personal affection one American president happens to feel for a British king. That is not a stable foundation for national sovereignty. It is a reminder of how completely the predictable machinery of international relations has broken down. Canada has been given time. What Carney does with that time, how Canada reinforces itself economically, unites itself politically, and prepares itself for pressures that will not disappear when this administration ends, will determine whether this moment is remembered as the turning point that saved Canadian independence, or simply as a pause in a longer and far more dangerous story. We cover developments on this story every day, so if you are not already following along, now is the time. If this opens your eyes to something the mainstream coverage is burying, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with your honest reaction. And if you want the full picture on stories like this one, delivered clearly and daily, without the noise and without the spin, join the community that is already paying attention. Hit subscribe. It takes 1 second, and it means you never miss the moment something this important breaks again.